So, what is history? Is it just a list of names and dates you had to memorize in school? Well, today we're going to dive a lot deeper than that. We're going to explore the real nature of history as a serious academic discipline and find out what it actually means to study and interpret the past.
Here's the roadmap for our discussion. First, we'll get to the heart of what history really is. Then, we'll look at how it's different from things like the past, memory, and myth. After that, we'll see how historians build a more complete picture. And finally, we'll explore the interesting relationship between history and the social sciences.
All right, let's jump right in with that big question. What actually is history? Because it's so much more than just a simple record of things that happened. It's an active intellectual pursuit. Let's unpack what that really means.
Okay, so at its core, history is an intellectual discipline. The main goal isn't just to list events, but to reconstruct and, this is the most important part, to interpret the incredibly complex story of human experience. And the whole thing is built on a foundation of analyzing evidence. It's an investigation, not just a list of facts.
This quote really nails it. Studying history isn't just about looking at events one by one. It's about fighting for a much broader understanding of context, of why things happened, and really of what it means to be human. So you can think of history as doing two major jobs at once. On one hand, yes, it's a record of what happened. But just as important, it gives us a framework. It provides the context and the tools we need to make sense of the challenges we're facing right now, in the present.
So where do historians get their clues? Well, they're kind of like detectives. They piece together the past using all sorts of evidence. You've got primary sources like diaries or letters from the time, and secondary sources, which are later analyses. They look at official documents, physical objects, stories passed down through oral traditions, and even how people at the time interpreted what was going on. The main takeaway here is that a real historical narrative is always built on evidence you can check, not just on speculation.
Okay, now that we have a good idea of what history is, it's just as crucial to understand what it isn't. And this is where it gets really interesting because we need to draw some clear lines between history and other ways we think about what came before, like the past, memory, and myth.
First up, the past versus history. Here's an analogy. Think of the past as a gigantic, chaotic ocean of everything that has ever happened. It's just there. History, on the other hand, is the act of fishing in that ocean. It's a deliberate process of choosing what to look for, analyzing the evidence you pull up, and then weaving it all into a narrative that tries to explain what happened and why.
Next, let's talk about memory. You know how families have stories that get told over and over? That's a kind of memory, but it's totally subjective, right? It's shaped by feelings, and it might change a little each time to make the family feel a certain way. History, in contrast, tries to be a fact-checker. It takes those memories, both personal and collective, and tests them against all the other available evidence to create a more objective, verifiable account. And finally, we have myth. Myths are these powerful stories that blend fact and fiction to teach us something, a cultural value, a moral lesson. The point of a myth isn't to be factually correct. It's about symbolism. History's job is to look at those myths, to untangle the evidence-based parts from the symbolic storytelling, and to figure out why those myths were so meaningful in the first place.
So, this table sums it all up really nicely. You see, history is interpretive and based on evidence. The past is just everything. Memory is subjective, based on what someone experienced. And myth is symbolic, rooted in a cultural story. They all relate to what came before, but only history has that rigorous, evidence-based method at its core.
Okay, so if history is this careful interpretation, how do historians make sure they're not just telling one narrow, biased story? Well, the answer is what we call a multidimensional approach. It's the recognition that the past is never a single story, but a complex web of interconnected forces.
To really get a full picture of a time period, historians have to look at it from all these different angles. They ask questions like, what was society like? Who held the political power? How did the economy work? What were the cultural values and religious beliefs? What was the physical environment like? Each one of these dimensions is a vital piece of a much larger puzzle.
Take social history, for example. This field moves the camera away from the kings and generals and zooms in on the lives of everyday people. It asks, what was it like to be a farmer, a merchant, or a woman during this time? It explores things like family, work, and community.
Then you have political history, which is maybe what we think of first. It's about governments, laws, and wars. But a modern historian knows that these political events don't just happen out of nowhere. They're always shaped by what's going on in the society and the economy at the time.
And in the same way, economic history looks at how people made, bought, and sold things. It shows us how huge economic forces, like trade routes or new technologies, have completely reshaped entire societies and driven major political conflicts.
The great historian Mark Bloch put it perfectly. He said that to really do history, you have to consider the totality of human activity. You can't understand the politics without the economics, or the culture without the social structure. It's all connected.
Now, this idea of looking at everything together leads us straight into our final section, the really fascinating and sometimes complicated relationship between history and the social sciences. Think of it as a constant conversation between two different ways of trying to understand people.
So what's the fundamental difference here? Well, traditionally, history is all about the specific. It wants to understand a particular event in its unique time and place. The social sciences, on the other hand, are often searching for the general. They're looking for broad patterns, theories, and rules that can apply across different societies.
A really famous attempt to bridge this gap was the Annales School in France. These historians pushed for a total history by borrowing tools from geography, sociology, and economics. They were especially interested in what they called the longue durée, those incredibly slow-moving, long-term changes, like shifts in climate or demographics, that shape societies over centuries.
The sociologist Max Weber is another fantastic example. His famous work argued that a specific set of religious ideas, the Protestant ethic, was a key ingredient in the rise of capitalism. You see, that's a perfect blend of deep historical investigation and broad sociological theory. But of course, not everyone was on board with this blending. You had historians like Leopold von Ranke who argued for a much more pure empirical approach. For him, the historian's only job was to stick to the primary sources and show exactly what truly occurred. He was really skeptical of trying to fit the messy details of the past into some big social science theory. And then, more recently, you get thinkers like Michel Foucault, who basically came along and challenged the whole thing. From a postmodernist view, he argued that neither history nor social science can ever be truly objective. He said that the questions we ask and the answers we find are always shaped by the power structures and biases of our own time. A completely neutral viewpoint for Foucault is simply impossible. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If history isn't just a perfect reflection of the past, but is instead an interpretation, one that's shaped by evidence, yes, but also by perspective and method, then can we ever truly know what happened? Maybe the real value of history isn't about finding one final absolute truth, but in the process itself, and the ongoing, critical, and ever-changing conversation we have with the past.